Good afternoon, everyone. This is John Rust on Rust on the Radio, the John Rust Show, broadcasting on Freedom 95, broadcasting at 950 AM and 95.9 FM on your radio dial, broadcasting all across the beautiful fruited plain of Indiana. God bless Rush Limbaugh. So, folks, I'm here in the studio with the Redneck Republican, Justin. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you so much, John. Always happy to come on the show.
So, folks, we are here in mid-July now, and we are going on a year and a half of Republican rule in the United States Senate, the House, and the presidency. And we have squandered that opportunity, absolutely squandered it. This is from Matt Van Swal on Twitter, and I want to read all of this because this is very important, and it is very key, and I think that's why we have to face the inaction of Banks and Young and Hounchin and all these career swamp rats in D.C. We have to face what they're doing to our party. So this is from Matt Van Swal. I don't think the GOP fully grasp, and this is radio, folks, so I got to tone this down a little bit, how badly they are effing up right now. I know that's a harsh term, but my gosh, we are wasting a massive opportunity. This is from Matt. I'm talking to people who normally have zero interest in politics, who are legitimately pissed off. They are not seeing the major reform they thought would happen and are really mad about it. There's been no true accountability, no true mass deportations, no meaningful decrease in the deficit. In fact, they've actually exponentially increased it by trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. Lots of very long vacations and no work. And this is from another tweet, but I want to read this. This is from The Persistence. He says, the U.S. Senate is getting ready to go on vacation again. On August 8th, they're taking 37 days off of paid vacation. You know, how pathetic.
I know. I've never seen a group of people work so little and go on vacation so much in my life.
While we face the consequences of massive government spending, massive government debt, massive inflation. Mm-hmm. You know what? And they, you know, they leave town and go on vacation and hit the beach somewhere. It is pathetic. So back to Matt. He says, I'm very worried the GOP is sleepwalking towards a midterm reckoning they don't see coming. People are pissed off that they voted Trump into office, and then the GOP continues to slow walk every reform people want, every one of them. You know, where are all the Doge cuts that were promised? You know, again, Elon Musk had identified up to $2 trillion, with a T, trillion dollars in cuts. You know, the House and the Senate only codified $10 billion, with a B, billion dollars of that, out of $2 trillion. We could have had a budget surplus this year had Elon Musk Doge Committee been allowed to function correctly. Instead, the Washington swamp rats rose up and said, no, we're not going to be cutting government spending whatsoever. They actually voted for, and listen to this, folks, Jim Banks, Todd Young, Aaron Hounchin, they all voted for Joe Biden levels of government spending, even though President Trump is now in office. You know, where is the SAVE Act? The House passed it. The Senate, they're doing zip about it. Nothing. They're going on vacation again.
Exactly. And, you know, the SAVE Act is, I mean, one, me and you can agree it's common sense to have
it's
voter
very common sense.
But even, like, look at Indiana, where even Democrats are saying it's common sense. You had Bo Biden, Blythe Potter, both say, the voter ID in Indiana works.
It's absolutely common sense, but people like Jim Banks and Todd Young, they thump their chest and say, oh, yeah, we're for it. But they do zip, zilch, not it to actually do anything about it in D.C. Other than say, well, I'd vote for it if we could, but, you know, our leader, John Thune, won't let us do that because of the threat of a filibuster or something like that. They are just hiding, folks. You know, why are bills passing the House where we only have a 1 or 2 vote majority, and the Senate with a 3 Republican vote majority is doing nothing about it. Absolutely nothing. You know, that's the pathetic part on this. You know, Jim Banks and Todd Young, they're hiding in a basement corner somewhere in the U.S. Capitol rather than doing their job, working for Hoosiers. You know, all they want to work for are the lobbyists. That's all they care about, is dialing for dollars. And again, this is from Matt Van Swal. I'm reading this direct. He says, why are the GOP still funding left-wing NGOs that target and hate MAGA Republicans? Why are members of the GOP pushing for amnesty instead of mass deportations?
Yeah, speaking of amnesty, I just saw the other day how Representatives Jim Baird and Mark Mesmer here in Indiana were pushing for amnesty.
Well, they want an influx of immigrants, folks, and this is all to appease their campaign donors who want cheap labor. I want Hoosier wages to go up. These career politicians want Hoosier wages to go down because they only care about their political donations, not about working Hoosiers, pure and simple. Remember, folks, Jim Banks called for an influx of immigration in 2017 in the Atlantic magazine. You can look it up.
Mm-hmm. They want our wages to go down and they want our taxes to go up. Anything that can cause us to have less money in our pockets.
Well, it's only because they want to protect the people like Mark Zuckerberg,
Mm-hmm.
Who Jim Banks likes to click champagne glasses with in D.C. Ugh. So, folks, people are waking up, and this is from Matt Van Swalt. People are waking up, and they aren't happy about it. People believed they were voting for the Trump agenda. Instead, they feel like they're getting the same old Washington. If Republicans in Congress don't start producing tangible results, they're going to discover the frustration has consequences. And by the time they realize how deep-seated that frustration is, it may already be too late. Folks, I would say, again, we're a year and a half into Republican majorities, and what have we got? All we have got is trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of new debt voted for by Aaron Houchin and Jim Banks and Todd Young.
Mm-hmm.
They are 3 peas in a pod.
It's been one of the most useless Republican majorities I think I've ever seen. Maybe in American history, I don't know.
Well, it's because they're swamp rats, folks. They only care about their careers and being beholden to the special interest in D.C. They don't want to fight for Hoosiers. I think that's why Jim Banks left Indiana and moved to Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
At least Todd Young lives in the state of Indiana.
Got to give him credit for that,
got to give him credit for that. Jim Banks abandoned our state as soon as he could and, left for Virginia, of all places. But, folks, on this immigration thing, we all see what's happening all across the state of Indiana. This is from Steve Ferguson. He says, how are 30% of Haitians living in the U.S. on temporary protected status able to get mortgages that American citizens would not qualify for? Why is Jim Banks, again, and Todd Young and Aaron Houchin allowing that to happen? We have a Republican majority. Why are we allowing Haitians to get these loans that American citizens are not even eligible for? What's up with that, Justin?
Exactly. It makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense. And yet these are supposed to be conservative warriors for a Republican state. It's like, what are we doing?
It's all hogwash. So, folks, in other news this week, President Trump had an address to the nation where he talked about China meddling in our elections. But I think the bigger story on that is why are Aaron Houchin, Jim Banks, and Todd Young allowing 500,000 Chinese to come here to study in our schools?
Mm-hmm. If China is meddling with our elections, if they're doing all this nasty stuff, yeah, exactly. Why are we letting their students come here?
And that's from Steve Ferguson, folks. He says China meddled in our elections. And in other news, 500,000 Chinese students are going to be admitted to the U.S. Make it make sense. Why do we have all these politicians who sit there and thump their chest about how bad China is, but actually do absolutely positively nothing about it in D.C. meaningful, other than tweet about it?
Exactly. My question is are the same amount of American students being admitted to China?
Of course not.
If it was going to be a fair trade, okay, whatever. But if it's not going to be a fair trade, what are we doing?
And so, folks, we were talking about this, and this is from Jacob Stewart, a bill co-sponsored by Representative Jim Baird and Mark Mesmer would grant legal status to undocumented agricultural workers.
Exactly. Like what is it? What is this?
And he used that word undocumented, but he means illegal.
Mm-hmm.
If you're here illegally, that means you're not here legally.
Mm-hmm.
End of sentence.
Exactly. You didn't come to the country the way you're supposed to. You didn't follow the process that, good freedom-loving people do. And I'm sorry, but at the end of the day, I don't think you should be here.
Well, if you come here, you have to follow the rules.
Exactly.
And you have to follow the laws.
Exactly. I mean, how is it going to be that your first, like when you came into the country, your first act was breaking the law? Like if you come in the country illegally, your first act in the country was breaking the law. How is that? The Republican Party is supposed to be the law and order party, right? That's what they always say, but yet they're allowing this to happen.
In other U.S. Senate news this week, we still have an AWOL U.S. Senator.
Mm-hmm.
Senator Mitch McConnell has been missing now, and there's been all kinds of interesting, what are alleged to be AI photos released of him. And some of them show him with Elvis and Ronald Reagan and stuff like that.
And I've seen some of those.
But is this guy dead? Is he on ice? To stop Thomas Massey from running for his Senate seat for a special election in Kentucky. In the end, Kentucky deserves a full-time U.S. Senator. No matter what your thoughts are on Mitch McConnell or any U.S. Senator, if they're not doing the job, they need to be replaced.
Exactly. And what's crazy to me is the fact that even the sitting governor doesn't know what was going on. Okay, if the common guy doesn't know, that's whatever. But the fact that the sitting governor is even I don't know what's going on with this guy,
well,
that is a problem.
We're going on several weeks now. And so if they can't come up with proof of life after several weeks, I think that means he really is dead somewhere. And that means the governor of Kentucky should absolutely act to allow Kentucky to be represented in the U.S. Senate. It's important.
Exactly.
There's legislative work to be done. Unfortunately, because of the actions of Jim Banks and Todd Young, who both voted for John Thune as Senate Majority Leader. And again, Jim Banks took over $300,000 from John Thune's super PAC. So, of course, he's going to be beholden to John Thune. But, these guys just want to go on perpetual vacation. Mm-hmm. Again, on August 8th, as I understand it, the Senate will go on vacation for 37 days. 37 days. Nice work if you can get it.
I know, right?
So, folks, we're running out of time for this segment. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the Senate becoming a hereditary peerage. We're going to be talking about the U.S. Senate seat for South Carolina and Lindsey Graham. This is John Rust on Rust on the Radio. We will be right back. Welcome back, folks. This is John Rust on the Radio, the John Rust Show, broadcasting on Freedom 95 at 950 AM and 95.9 FM on your radio dial, broadcasting all across the beautiful fruited plain of Indiana. So, folks, we're talking about the U.S. Senate seat in South Carolina. Lindsey Graham's sister was temporarily appointed to fill that seat for a few months until the new election coming up this fall. However, now she's decided she's going to run, and she's getting a lot of endorsements from the swamp rats in D.C. Folks, the U.S. Senate is not a hereditary peerage, pure and simple. Just because, it is sad that her brother died, grant that. But that doesn't mean you get to represent the people of South Carolina in the U.S. Senate just because your brother died.
Exactly. A U.S. Senate seat is not something to be inherited. That's not, it's not the way it works.
Well, even in Britain, they did away with that. And now the House of Lords is no longer hereditary, which is a good thing. I just do not believe in these family dynasties ruling from the grave.
Exactly.
And again, that's what's happening with Mitch McConnell. He is still ruling from the grave.
Exactly. And going back to Darlene Graham, I mean, I didn't much like her being appointed to it, but if it was just going to be for the remainder of the term and then that was it, if she was just going to be like a caretaker, then okay, fine. That's okay. But then now she's running for the full term. She's going to have incumbency advantage.
And no one knows anything about her real political beliefs.
Exactly. I mean,
she's a blank slate as far as anyone knows.
Exactly. I mean, she could be a rock-solid conservative, but then she could also be a Lisa Murkowski. Lisa Murkowski is someone
But she should face a primary.
Exactly.
And she should run for it. And it shouldn't just be all swept under the rug and everyone pushed aside to make it only for her. So I hope we have a real primary contest in South Carolina. I do not believe in these coronations, and that's what happened, in my case with Jim Banks. He was he was coronated by the Washington, D.C. swamp, who decided he would represent Indiana, not the voters of Indiana. So they threw me off the ballot in 2024 because they knew I would work for Hoosiers and that Jim Banks would work for the swamp rats, because he is a swamp rat.
And the Abraham Lincoln quote that you love is that elections are for the people. It's their decision. Well, the people didn't get a decision in your case, and their decision is they're not really going to have a decision in South Carolina.
Correct. The Washington swamp won in Indiana, unfortunately, in 2024, but we will see how that goes forward in the future. And unfortunately, the swamp appears to be winning in South Carolina right now, but we shall see what happens on that. In other news, just recently, folks, unfortunately, listen to this. This is from Jason Cottrell on Twitter. He says, killed in committee by Representative Hounchin, an absolute traitor. And it's talking about, this is from the General, the United States House has rejected Thomas Massey's amendment to stop the integration of the United States military with Israel's under Section 219 of the NDAA. Folks, I am a strong supporter of Israel. I support Israel's right to exist, absolutely. But that does not mean we integrate our military with theirs. The United States needs a military only for the United States. I believe in America first, not Israel first.
Exactly.
We have to be Americans, absolutely 100% always first.
And I want to point something out. I guarantee a vast majority of the people pushing this are the same people who say, oh, you shouldn't be able to hold dual citizenship and serve in, politics or whatever. I'm like, okay, I agree with that. I don't think you should. But if we don't want people to have dual citizenship, how are we now going over and saying, oh, we should integrate our military with a whole other country? Well, what are we doing?
And this is from James Speed Rogers. He says a vast majority of the Republican Party in the U.S. Senate voted to merge the American and Israel armies. That's just wrong. Again, I believe in being America first, USA first, 100%.
Exactly.
But that is not taking anything away from Israel. And folks, the story behind this, and you're thinking, well, what's going on all this? Folks, look at who is supporting financially our Indiana politicians. Look at who just gave money to Todd Rokita, for instance. Look at all the money from AIPAC going to Jim Banks, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. Who really controls Jim Banks? Well, we know Hoosiers don't control him because he was selected to be in the U.S. Senate, not elected by a fair primary with an opponent, me, that wanted to say, hey, we need an actual Hoosier who will fight for Hoosiers.
Exactly. And I'm not one of these people that thinks, AIPAC is this big evil boogeyman or whatever, but it's the fact that much money, the amount of money they give to candidates, no matter what PAC it would be, that much money coming from one place going to one person is a recipe for disaster.
Well, and it was tens of millions of dollars in the case of going against Thomas Massey.
Exactly.
Tens of millions of dollars.
Exactly. AIPAC basically bought a United States congressional seat with Thomas Massey's election. AIPAC bought it. Plain and simple.
Going back to Matt Van Swallen, what he was talking about, this is from Dan Hill. He says, we have been running 1.5 years now of Republican majority in the U.S. Senate and the House. But in the Senate, it's particularly egregious because they have been running these pro forma sessions to block President Trump. That's a year. This is from Dan Hill, a year of refusing to pass the SAVE Act. 1.5 years of Senate Republicans refusing to listen to their own constituents. Now they're asking us to send them money and, to help reelect them. Dan Hill says, I'm thinking about that. The time has come, folks, where you have to get rid of all incumbents no matter what. I just don't believe in reelecting career politicians. That's why we have the mess we're in. That's why we have trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars voted on by Aaron Hounchin, Jim Banks, and Todd Young, all of them, 3 peas in a pod, no difference whatsoever in fiscal policy. We have no economic conservatives in the Republican Party. We just have swamp rats in the Republican Party who believe in expanding and growing government, who believe in and voted for Joe Biden levels of government spending. Again, Aaron Houchin, Jim Banks, and Todd Young all voted for government funding at Joe Biden levels. And folks, last week, Governor Braun announced the state would no longer have DEI in terms of state contracts. But guess what, folks? The Indiana Republican Party has DEI for how we run our own political party. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. We need to absolutely do away with DEI in the Indiana Republican Party. Well, the Republican Party is a private organization. It's funded by taxpayer money for our primary elections. But the Republican Party, point of fact, today has rules in place on gender equality. I always feel no matter what, you have to have the best candidate instead of the candidate who meets a gender identification.
Exactly.
And that's what's happening in the Republican Party today. Did you know that? So, for instance, the county chair, if the county chair is female, the vice chairman has to be a male.
And see, that's just like...
Or vice versa. If the vice chair is female, then the county chair has to be male.
See, like, what sense does that make?
And the Republican Party, and that's why I say, folks, over and over again, the Indiana Republican Party is really the Democrat Party from a few decades ago.
Exactly.
And the Democrat Party, they're just insane.
Exactly.
And so we get stuck with the lesser of two evils. Instead of having the lesser of two evils, we need to have economic conservatives again.
Exactly. And back with the Republican Party, it's like, we're the ones who always claim stuff should be based on merit this, merit that. But then you look at what we're doing with the party rules. You look at your Senate race again. It wasn't based on merit. It was based on who they wanted in there.
It's based on who's kissing whose wazoo.
Exactly. And then that isn't what America was supposed to be about. And that's not what they were.
Okay. Folks. Speaking of all this bootlicking from all these people. Why are Jim Banks and Todd Young still licking Mitch McConnell's boots, even though he's probably dead right now? That's what's going on right now.
Exactly.
They still believe in the Washington swamp. And Aaron Houchin, Aaron Houchin, Jim Banks, and Todd Young, they all voted against releasing the Epstein files, every single one of them. And Jim Banks and Todd Young both voted for the First Step Act, which released criminals from prison early. What's up with that? Why do we have all these fake politicians who thump their chest on how quote-unquote conservative they are in Indiana, but vote the exact opposite in D.C.? It happens over and over and over again. And we pay the price for that, particularly in terms of deficit spending and what's happening with our nation's debt. We are now nearing, folks, $40 trillion, with a T, trillion dollars of U.S. debt. That's $1 million per American family in debt. Thanks to Todd Young and Jim Banks and Aaron Houchin. That is a massive amount of debt. So, folks, I just checked. It is $356,000 of debt per taxpayer. That's up over $30,000 per taxpayer in the last year. Again, that's $30,000 of debt thrown on your shoulders by Jim Banks, Todd Young, and Aaron Houchin. And that's who gets forced on Hoosiers, is people like that who vote for this massive amount of debt. The Republican Party, folks, should be economically conservative. We need to be cutting government spending vastly. And that's just not happening now at all.
Exactly.
And it's right here in the state of Indiana. Look at our Republican Party. All they do is dream about ways to tax you more and more. Look what's happening on the tolls, where tolls are now authorized for every mile of Indiana interstates. Every square mile are now authorized to be tolled by any future governor, Democrat or Republican. And that was by a Republican supermajority state legislature. That is not acceptable. So, folks, we're out of time for this segment. When we come back, we're going to dig into more Indiana local politics. This is John Rust on the Radio. Stay tuned. Welcome back, folks. This is John Rust on the Radio on Freedom 95, broadcasting at 950 AM and 95.9 FM on your radio dial. Broadcasting all across the beautiful fruited plain of Indiana. God bless Rush Limbaugh.
Mm-hmm.
So, folks, between the break, I was talking to Justin. There's a interesting story coming up about Todd Young pushing this bill to ban stock trading in Washington, D.C. I 100% support that. But it should also include all members of the executive branch and their families. You know, the presidency, the Senate, the House. No elected officials or their families should be trading because they have inside information.
Exactly, and the families thing is important because as soon as you don't add that caveat, we all know what's going to happen. It's just going to be their families. They're going to tell their families what they know, and then it's like we know how that's going to work out. So
but it needs to be for the executive branch too.
Exactly,
it has to be for everyone in Washington D.C. because, folks, if you or I traded stocks like that with insider information, we'd go to prison.
Exactly.
It happened to Martha Stewart.
Exactly.
But instead, these congressmen and senators, they sit there and they trade all day, and they're making lots and lots and lots of money. Just look at Jefferson Shreve's
Exactly,
trades.
Literally, and it's like it gets to the point. Public service should be about serving the public, not serving yourself. That is the key here that I want to point out.
Well, I do like one thing Todd Young said. He said he has never traded one stock while he has served in the U.S. Senate. And I applaud that.
I've got to respect him for that. You got to give it. I know we like to dump on him a lot, but we give credit where credit's due.
He's given us trillions of dollars in new debt added to our shoulders, but at least he didn't make money off of it personally.
Right. Yeah. Like I said, you got to. Rob Kendall says the same thing. You got to give him credit where credit's due. So like I said.
But here's the thing, folks. Again, this is, I think, is another instance of these Washington insiders coming back and thumping their chest on a popular issue, and everyone says, "Oh, that's wonderful. I agree 100%." Because you would be wrong to disagree with
exactly.
That. But will it ever pass? No, it will never ever pass. Number one, it will never pass because they really don't want it to pass. They want it as a talking point. So they can say in the future, well, I worked against that, but gosh darn it, it didn't ever pass, but boy, I'm sure against it. Well, make it happen. They won't. You know why, folks? Again, they want the issue. They want to be able to thump their chest and say, well, this is why I'm, XYZ good on this subject, because I actually have a bill. But, does it matter if the bill never passed? That's my big beef with Jim Banks. He likes to file lots of bills in the House and the Senate. Hardly any of them ever see the light of day. Folks, it doesn't matter unless it passes. And that's why I don't like these politicians who give this red meat commercial about this one issue that they really have no intention of it ever passing. You can't just, bring these red meat issues and not actually get them passed. That's the problem with all of this. So, folks, in Indiana news, this is from the Indy Reporter, and this is Indy_Reporter_ on Twitter. Again, I highly recommend that Twitter account. It's a must follow in the state of Indiana. This is his tweet. He says, the Indiana Economic Development Corporation approved a $250,000 contract, $250,000, with the D.C. Grand Prix Incorporated for a race suite at the 2026 Freedom 250 Grand Prix in Washington, D.C. The contract includes a private monument suite, 30 tickets, all-inclusive food and beverages, and an option to buy up to 10 more tickets at $5,000 each. The executive document summary says the contract is for the rental of a race suite for the Freedom 250 IndyCar race. Meanwhile, taxpayers get the bill. Folks, why on earth are Hoosier taxpayer dollars going towards a luxury suite in Washington, D.C. $250,000.
Exactly. Who asked for that? Like, what Hoosier actually wanted that?
Folks, and we talked about this last week, Indiana is swimming in taxpayer money. We are now projected to have, I believe, a $2 billion, with a B, billion-dollar tax surplus this year. And they are blowing it on $80 million in bonuses for certain state employees. You know, what's up with that?
Mm-hmm.
$250,000 for these luxury suites in Washington, D.C. for a race.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's not benefiting Hoosiers. That is only costing Hoosiers. That's where we have to have fiscal responsibility again. And once again, folks, in no way, shape, or form can you say the Indiana Republican Party is economically conservative. You just can't.
No, I mean they just, and it's
It's just continuously spending and spending and spending. You know, and it starts from the top down.
Mm-hmm.
This is where I had the issue with Diego, where he bought that $90,000 SUV with taxpayer money from a political donor.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that stuff needs to be investigated. It can't just be whitewashed out and said, oh, well, we're going to fire some people and move forward. We need an actual investigation of every dollar spent by the Secretary of State's office. We have to do that for the future of the Republican Party, folks. We have to come clean on what happened there. You know, Todd Rokita himself said we had scandals, with an S, scandals, plural, in the Secretary of State office. Why aren't we actually investigating that today? Instead, they are trying to sweep it under the rug, and they just say, oh, well, we're just going to change everyone around a little bit, but we're not going to reveal any details on what happened. That's wrong, in my opinion. We have to fix the root of the cause. And the root on all this is money.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one thing that Bo Bai came out this week and said he would ban any state contracts going to any political donor. Let's get Max Engling to say that. You know, why not? Why would he not do that unless he was trying to hide something? Let's get Greg Ballard to say the same thing, and let's get them to act on it and not just say it. You know, Max Engling called for a special investigator into the Secretary of State's office, but he quickly backed off of that, you know, when pushed on that. We have to have a real investigation, folks. You know, Max Engling called for a special investigator. I think we have to get a special prosecutor in there who is completely independent to find out where all this money went and what was happening behind the scenes. That's what we have to know to clean up our state, folks. If we don't do that, we will keep going down this road of corruption that is systemic to the Indiana Republican Party establishment. Once again, it's the establishment, not the grassroots folks. You know, the Tea Party people are wonderful. You know, the folks on the ground doing the actual day-to-day campaigning at the ground level are wonderful. You know, there is no more, you know, they are the salt of the earth. But unfortunately, we are led by these establishment figures actually pushed on us by Washington, D.C. to govern our state, and we have no choice in the matter. That's the sad part on all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And it leads directly, you know, a hot topic right now is property taxes. I have billboards all across the state of Indiana calling for an end to property taxes. Folks, we have so much money in Indiana coffers today, we can end property tax entirely today because of our surplus and because we have to do meaningful cuts in government spending, which the Indiana Republican establishment absolutely refuses to do.
Mm-hmm.
There are billions and billions and billions of dollars in cuts that can be found and implemented today, but the Republican Party establishment does not want to cut off any funding to these bureaucrats because they rely on those bureaucrats for their own support.
Exactly, and to give everybody an idea of how the Indiana Republican establishment works, there's a guy who's like, oh yeah, J.D. Prescott, he's like, you know, I got a bill that's going to that's going to get rid of property taxes. Well, guess what? That 7% sales tax on services that he proposes would end up raising taxes anyway. You would end up paying more taxes with the tax on services than you would with the property taxes. So it's like, oh yeah, we're getting rid of one tax, but we're going to put in another one that just raises taxes anyway. Like, what are we doing?
And folks, what he's talking about, what Justin's talking about there, is J.D. Prescott has a bill that he's going around pushing right now, which has good intentions. It's to do away with property tax entirely. But he just wants to replace it with a tax on services that actually increases the tax on Hoosiers even more than where we're taxed at today. It's a $4 billion, with a B, billion-dollar tax increase. So they're saying to you, well, cut your property taxes, but you got to pay way more in another way for it. No. No, let's cut government spending for a change. Folks, the problem is all these career politicians only see their lives through the eyes of spending bureaucrats, not through the eyes of working Hoosiers who are having to pay the taxes that finance all this. Indiana has a balanced budget amendment, so the Republican establishment just continue to look for new and more deceiving ways to actually tax us through these wheel taxes, through local income taxes, through our state income tax, through our sales tax, which is the second highest in the country, only behind California. Once again, folks, the Republicans like to say, oh, we're not California. We're fast becoming California in Indiana with the level of taxes, with our ridiculously high sales tax already. And with the property tax assessment system being so blatantly unfair. The issue, folks, on the property tax is how they are assessed. Your home property tax should never be assessed on what your neighbor sells their home for. I think in the end, it should only be what you actually physically paid. By doing it the way they're doing it now, they are taxing your home as an unrealized gain, and that's un-American. We don't do that here. It's anti-conservative. Only the Democrats like to tax unrealized gains. Kamala Harris got in trouble and called out by a lot of Republicans when she wanted to tax everyone's 401ks by taxing unrealized gains in your 401k. And the Republicans said, oh, no, wait a second, you can't do that. But Indiana is doing the exact same thing today with your home property tax. It's exactly the same. So, folks, we're out of time for this segment. When we come back, we're going to dig into data centers a little bit on the John Rush Show on Freedom 95. Stay tuned. Welcome back, folks. This is John Rust on the Radio on Freedom 95, broadcasting at 950 AM and 95.9 FM on your radio dial, broadcasting all across the beautiful fruited plain of Indiana. So, folks, before the break, we were talking about J.D. Prescott's plan to tax services rather than property. And once again, Indy Reporter brought up an interesting point, and this goes into data centers. And this is from Indy Reporter again, Indy_Reporter on Twitter. He says, one of my tinfoil hat theories is that J.D. Prescott's property tax plan is really designed to benefit data centers and other large commercial property owners. Over the past few years, J.D. has had plenty of meetings with lobbyists representing utility and energy companies. Again, this is from Indy Reporter. After all, utility companies would stand to benefit significantly if their property tax burden were reduced. Folks, what I don't like about the whole thing on data centers, and this is happening nationwide, is how the people that are speaking out against data centers are being vilified. They're actually being arrested. The backstory on this in Indiana, look at what happened in Shelbyville. We had the mayor of Shelbyville say really derogatory things about Hoosiers who were opposed to data centers. He called their houses something very, very bad. You can't say that term on the radio. I'll say crappy, the polite term. That's what these leaders, that's what these quote-unquote leaders think of actual Hoosiers. That we all live in crappy homes if we're opposed to these data centers. I view these data centers as first and foremost a cancer being introduced to Indiana. It's not a wonderful thing. These data centers are taking our energy, they're taking our electricity. What for? Folks, it is a land rush by the tech trillionaires to control all of our data. It's not anything else. Some people like to say, well, you need it for your photos on your iPhone. No, you don't. Your phone worked just fine storing your photos before any data center was built in the last 3 years.
Exactly.
I seem to recall my iPhone 10 years ago had photo storage on it. And now they're saying, well, you won't have pictures anymore on your phone. Oh, that's hogwash, folks. Yeah, they may be in a cloud somewhere, but that's not what these data centers are really about. These data centers are about collecting massive amounts of data on you and making you pay for it to get it back. The artificial intelligence, it is all about harvesting your data so that the tech billionaires and trillionaires own it, not you. So this is from an article by the Feed Ski. On Twitter, it says, Oklahoma farmer gets arrested for speaking 5 seconds over his allotted time at an AI data center town hall meeting.
Good Lord. That's got to be the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard.
And I'm showing in this, if you all go to YouTube, you can see a video of this. I'm showing the picture of the guy. I'm showing it to Justin right now. This guy was arrested for daring speak just a few seconds over his allotted time. That is these tactics being used against the people speaking up against data centers. And that's the big issue, folks, that we are facing right now here in the state of Indiana. And this is from Daniel Elliott. He says, I just spoke about the future of AI at the Regional Chamber of Northeast Indiana. I know it's not the regular political drama on social media, but policy actually does have an impact on our future, and someone has to do it. What he's talking about there, folks, is implementing data centers on Hoosiers. No. Again, look at what our electricity rates are doing. Indiana was up 17% last year and 9% the year before that on just electricity. Look at what is happening to all the groundwater. Hoosiers cannot afford these massive electric rate increases that we are getting that are a direct result of all these data centers literally taking all of the energy our power plants can produce here in the state of Indiana. And folks, we talked about this last week where Chuck Goodrich has been named the Indiana Secretary of Commerce, despite the fact that his company literally gets much of their work from data centers. A lot of the tech trillionaires were all pushing global warming until they realized, oh, wait, these data centers are using so much energy now, we have to backpedal on that. And so you don't hear near the story in the United States on global warming from, the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, other than I think you saw these massive, billion-dollar boats they have. What's the climate footprint of one of those boats? But folks, we are still blessed in the United States. We don't have to face what Britain faces. Listen to this. This is from GB News, Great Britain News on Twitter. Britons have been ordered to remove air conditioning from homes in Britain in 40 degrees Celsius heat under a net zero crackdown. So, folks, it reached over 100 degrees in Britain, but they can't use their air conditioners.
I mean,
and you know why? Because Britain has went so nuts on the net zero scam, only relying on solar and wind, that they don't have enough energy for their homes now. And so they're saying you can't have air conditioning. And what will happen is, and this is happening here in the United States, there are actually utilities that are looking to restrict power to homes so they can funnel all of their energy to these data centers rather than to people's homes. That's absolutely wrong.
I mean, this is third world country stuff. I mean, like, what are we doing? Like, and do you remember a couple weeks ago in New York City when Zohran Mamdani was saying, don't set your ACs any lower than like it was like 77 degrees or something like that because the power grid couldn't handle it. You're telling me that the so-called greatest city in the world doesn't have a good enough power grid to allow people to set their ACs at like 72 or something, 75, something a bit more comfortable.
And folks, that will happen here. If you remember back in the snowstorm we had in January last year, we had the power companies warning Hoosiers to actually turn their thermostats down in the winter to conserve electricity. And they weren't saying this out loud, but they were saying that because they wanted that electricity for these data centers that have moved in. So, folks, we're going to be freezing in the winter and sweltering in the summer so that data center humming next door to you can keep going. And I want to go into this on Chuck Goodrich a little bit. This is from Indie Reporter, and it's a long tweet, but I want to read it. It's very important. I saw something on Hannah News, Indiana, and I had to verify it for myself. Governor Braun has appointed Chuck Goodrich as Indiana's Secretary of Commerce. Chuck Goodrich is the CEO of Gaylor Electric and a former Indiana state representative. Gaylor Electric proudly markets itself as an industry leader in designing and building some of the largest and most complex data centers in the country. Less than a year before Goodrich became state representative, Gaylor Electric was approved a $1.5 million tax incentive from the Indiana Economic Development Corporation. His company got $1.5 million in that tax incentive. And this is, again, from Indie Reporter. He says, remember former state auditor Tara Klutz? She resigned from office and became the chief financial officer of Gaylor Electric. So let's put this together. The CEO of a company that received IEDC incentives and specializes in building data centers is now Indiana's Secretary of Commerce. You know, the Indiana Secretary of Commerce is the person overseeing the state's economic development efforts. As Indiana, again, this is from Indie Reporter, as Indiana aggressively pursues billions of dollars in new data center development. At the same time, the company's CFO is a former statewide elected official.
You know, that just tells you all you need to know about, our state government's, attitude toward data centers and how they're going to, continue to govern in the future.
Because it economically advances their own personal pocketbooks.
Exactly.
Not Hoosier pocketbooks.
Exactly.
Not Hoosier taxpayer pocketbooks.
Exactly.
That's the problem we're facing today, folks.
And it allows them to pick their own winners and losers, and that's what our state government's been about for who knows how long. That's what they love doing. They love to be able to pick who they want to win, and who, just like, again, not to go back to your Senate race, they wanted to pick who they wanted to win and who they wanted to lose.
No, they did not want anyone fighting for Hoosiers in there. They had to have someone who's on the take.
Exactly.
And they had to have someone who's under the control of the swamp, both here in Indiana and in D.C.
Exactly.
So, folks, we're out of time. I want to close with a quote from the Principles of Liberty that I got from a recent Tea Party event, and it's from the National Center for Constitutional Studies. And this, I'm going to read principle number 3 today. The most promising method of securing a virtuous and morally stable people is to elect virtuous leaders. Folks, we don't have that today in Indiana. That's the problem in a nutshell. A career politician 99.9% of the time cannot be virtuous because they're only in it for their career, not for the taxpayer, not for the voter. So I'm going to close with my father's favorite Bible verse, Psalm 118, verse 24. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Folks, I'll see you all again next week on the radio. This is John Rust.